This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
You're listening to the Friday morning break with John Gibbs on Teachers Talk Radio. And this week my guests are Cassie Edmiston and Paul Grady from the Prisoners Education Trust. And we are going to discuss the challenges, the obstacles, the difficulties that you might imagine with prison education. And of course, the enormous rewards and necessity for prison education.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
And welcome. As the music dies away, you're listening to Teachers Talk Radio. And you might be listening live on a Friday morning, in which case this is a recorded interview, but I am in the background, so I can answer your questions if you wish to send them in on Podbean. Also, you might well be knowing from listening to my past shows that I've been exploring what schools are for, what education is for, with expert guests. So if you wish to listen to past episodes as a podcast, and if you are listening to a podcast, by the way, in a few weeks' time, I hope you're enjoying the summer holidays, because it's getting tantalizingly close for us teachers. If you are listening to this as a podcast, you want to listen to more like this, you can find us on Podbean, on Spotify, and you can search the back catalogue. And if you look at John Gibbs' Friday morning break, you find the past interviews I've done with people from different schools and academics and writers and authors. My guests this week are from the Prison Education Trust. And I would like to welcome Cassie Edmiston and Paul Grady. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, well.
You're very welcome indeed. And I've got to say that, as I say, the theme to people listening to this, if you've listened to past Teachers Talk Radio, you know that what I've been doing as a retired teacher is sort of exploring how education works, how schools work, so with the help of expert guests and so on. It must be, as you said, we're going to get on to the particular environment of education within a prison. And it must pose particular challenges if someone is in a situation where they think the Prison Education Trust is. How would they find out about it? Is it something that prisoners, people in prison, are alerted to, or is it something they sort of have to stumble across? A bit like I did, I suppose.
A lot of my answers to these questions will be it's a bit of a mix. Education departments all know about Prisoners Education Trust. Within Prisoners Education Trust is part of the ecosystem of broader prison education provision. So there are contracted education providers who provide literacy, numeracy, and some other kind of more basic level qualifications, and a few workshops and those sorts of things. And what we sit in is that kind of level 2 upwards, so sort of low GCSE upwards opportunities to progress. So people can go to education department. Depending on the regime, there are issues around that at the moment too. But all education staff tend to know about Prison Education Trust and can signpost people and show them our prospectus and talk through the options. Some people will hear through, there's a prison newspaper called Inside Time, and we highlight a course in every edition of that, which comes out monthly, to give people a flavour of the different types of courses they can do. And that's the real beauty of PET's offering, is that we have over 130 different courses in everything from beekeeping to plumbing, so people can sort of really get that, sort of find the course that's right for them. And sometimes we do work with prison radio, and then the one of the key areas is really people in prison passing word of mouth, and people telling other people about PET and what's available. We get quite a lot of applications from people who said that they saw someone on their wing studying or a cellmate studying and wanting to do the same. That kind of, I think we all know that real benefit of education and learning, the ripple effect it has, and we see that quite tangibly in the applications that we receive.
That's interesting you should say that, because anyone thinking about looking back on my education career and so on, it seems self-evident that education, is a good thing. That education transforms lives, it develops, gives people opportunities, and so on. And I would imagine, therefore, that you'd be welcomed with open arms. It would be it would be highly encouraged that there should be education, and it would be a substantial part of what the experience of prison is. Since prison has a number of objectives, but one of them must be to give people the ability and the skills and so on to thrive in the world when they leave. So do you find it a welcoming sort of environment?
Again, yeah, I think lots of people definitely recognise the importance of it, but the challenge is the reality within which they're working.
Right.
You'll have seen in the press recently, for a long time, the prison population has been growing and has repeatedly hit kind of crisis point. It's going to be one of the big challenges for any incoming government after the election. And within that, education is a strand of provision that's trying to be delivered in a very overstretched, overpopulated regime, and in a regime where often security will take precedence. You often have staff shortages, so due to sickness, lots of people have been leaving the service. They have pulled other people back in, but overall there's still not enough staff to literally move people around the prison. And so, although I think notionally lots of people sort of agree in principle with the idea of education being very important, the reality is very different in terms of where it sits in the priority within a prison structure, and the resources it then has available to run classes or to do any of the sort of other education provision beyond what PET does. And I think that's sort of an area that prison teachers are doing really incredible things in a very difficult environment and having to think very differently and very creatively about how they work with the populations that they have, who are often got huge variety in academic ability, lots of neurodiversity and different types of neurodivergence they need to work with. They won't have access to the same digital tools as in the community, probably none at all. We've seen sort of prison teachers showing people in prison kind of pictures of apps that you might find on your phone because they're obviously not allowed devices in there, and sort of trying to think differently and creatively about how they can teach different subjects in a very limited and constrained way. And I think that trying to do a marvellous job in that setting.
Yes, I can imagine. Really, you're outlining some of the problems that you're describing there and some of the difficulties that need to be overcome. Paul, before I come to you, I'll ask one last question. Who are the teachers and the instructors, and what sort of people and what sort of backgrounds do they tend to come from?
It's a real mix, actually. So there's some who have been teaching and have in the community and then moved across in various different settings, often FE and HE. Prison Education Trust used to run an alliance called the Prisoner Learning Alliance. And on the website, there's a series of blogs about different routes into teaching. And that really demonstrates the many and varied routes that people have found into that career path. And for some, it was a primary school teacher who then ended up using those skills to teach literacy and numeracy in a prison setting. Someone else was an HGV driver who then ended up doing a driving instructor course on the outside and then use those skills to run a workshop on the inside. So they're a real mix of people, but I think what comes throughout all of those blogs is the kind of real commitment to wanting to make a difference. And what that means in a prison setting. And I think a number of them comment on wanting to come into that career, and I think a lot of people in the sector have that kind of, want to change lives. And obviously that's a very important long-term aim. But I think what you soon realise in a prison setting is that it's the small wins that you have to start with that then accumulate to build to a long-term success. So it could just be getting someone into the classroom as the first challenge, not only because they may not want to be there, but because there may not have been the staff to bring them in. And then it's getting them to engage in some way positively, thinking about different ways that you can sort of hook them into learning. And again, that's where distance learning, what we do, is quite helpful, because we might be the provider of a particular subject or topic that gets people really excited and is that hook. I think we often talk about the hook for learning, and I think that's where sort of PET can come in. But yeah, teachers come and educators come from a wide range of backgrounds, but the thing that unites a lot of them is that real motivation and desire to make a difference in a difficult environment that a lot of people just don't want to engage with.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading. Introducing My New Term, the revolutionary technology application connecting schools and candidates directly. Whether you're a school seeking to streamline your recruitment process, or a candidate searching for your next role in education, My New Term has the solution. Developed by a former teacher, the technology at My New Term now connects tens of thousands of candidates with schools every month by digitising the recruitment process. As a candidate, you can search for jobs, set up recommended jobs, and save time by applying directly to schools via a standardised online process. No more completing manual and repetitive application forms. Employers can streamline processes and save time utilising the leading applicant tracking system for schools and multi-academy trusts. Recruitment in education has been broken for too long. My New Term is on a mission to change just that. Visit mynewterm.com to learn more, search all the latest opportunities, or schedule a demo. My New Term, shaping the future of education recruitment.
Hi everyone, it's Tom here from Teachers Talk Radio, just dropping by to tell you about our annual history teaching extravaganza, Teachers Talk History, which is coming at you live in Manchester on the 21st of September. The tickets are completely free for classroom teachers, amazing speakers, brilliant contributors, and a fantastic opportunity to network with fellow professionals. Grab your free ticket today at ttradio.org/events, and we will see you there.
You are listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs on Teachers Talk Radio. My guest this morning, Cassie Edmiston, Paul Grady from the Prisoners Education Trust. And we're discussing the challenges, the rewards, and the necessity of prison education. Now, Paul, if I can turn to you, and welcome to the show. How did you first hear about the Prisoners Education Trust, and how did you first become involved?
Well, first of all, I was actually in prison doing education. The first time I ever heard about the prison education probably wasn't much long on the active side, probably the early 90s. And they used to do a small arts grant back then, where you could put an application in for funding for art materials and stuff. And art has always been something that I did. And I put in for it back then, and this would have been probably around about 93, if I remember rightly, around about that time, I think. And that was my first sort of introduction to prison education course. And then learning about all that they do, all of the courses that they offer. I mean, sorry, go on.
Well, how did you hear about it, first of all? Was it someone said to you in prison, or someone you saw in the prison newspaper?
It was generally, I believe, back then it would have been the teachers in the education department that told us about prison education, because back then it was still fairly new. And there is, right now, the Harvard Trust produced a copy of charities that supply funds to prisoners and people in prison, people just getting out of prison as well. The Prison Education Trust is in that. I remember learning about them in that as well. So there's the information's out there. It's just sort of disseminated to the people that are actually in prison. If you don't go to the education department, you don't know about this.
Yes.
And generally, it is word of mouth. If somebody's doing a course,
right?
Somebody will tell you, and it's like, oh, where did you get that? Prison Education Trust. How do I do it? And
initially, you wanted art supplies, or you heard that is that because you were able to use art, or something you become interested in, or something that you?
I've always been able to draw ever since I was young. Really, the tale I tell is that I drew a tattoo on somebody's arm when I was 8 years old. They were a lot older than I was, and they knew how good I was at art, even then at 8 years old. And I drew a picture of Ada the Horrible on his arm, who was a character in The Sun many, many years ago. And his friend then tattooed that on his arm. So there's somebody walking around, we were drawing that I do when I was 8 years old on their skin. Yes, I've always been being able to draw and being interested in art. So back in the early 90s when I did that, it was somewhat more or less to get me through being in prison. Later on, it has led to other stuff. And the Prison Education Trust helped me further on down the line when I actually took it a step further. And when, first of all, I started doing distance learning while I was in prison. an art degree, which took too long. And eventually I started doing day release and going to university, where I managed to get a BA in arts and then finally did a master's once I got released.
Wow.
So through that little path to do pens and pencils led me to going to doing a master's. So, it's like you say, it's little things that sort of get you hooked in and keep you moving on and forward.
That's interesting. Cassie, is that something that you see in other people's experiences, that they start with something a bit tentative at first, and then they realise the possibilities, and that leads to one thing, leads to another?
Yeah, absolutely, all the time. I think it's education can be very daunting. I think particularly in any sense, particularly if you didn't have a particularly positive experience when you were younger. A lot of people may not have been to school at all or were expelled, and there's a lot of sort of very dysfunctional relationships, I think, with education, and a lot of people will feel like they are will have been made to feel stupid, unintentionally sometimes perhaps, but nonetheless it's how they feel. They don't want to engage. And so I think that any way that you can get people to just start that journey, and then, as Paul was saying, it just sort of builds from there in terms of the starting point. We don't fund art materials anymore, but we obviously still fund the range of courses. And so starting out with we have a number of free taster courses, so people might start with that and try out doing a bit of distance learning through a short free course, and then realise, oh, maybe I can do this, and then they'll progress to the next. And I think the current stat is something like 70% of last year's students that we funded have gone on to further study. And so I think it really is a hook for progressing further and further. And it doesn't always have to lead to a master's. That's obviously kind of incredible educational journey. But I think any progress or anything that gives someone that sense of self-worth and belief in themselves is really important. And just the connections it fosters. I was reading earlier someone talking about studying and how their child will bring their GCSE homework into prison so they can work on it together, and he wouldn't have felt able to help her with that before had he not been studying his course. And I think all of those things, like I said earlier, that kind of ripple effect of it doesn't just help the learner, it helps the people around them, whether that's positively within the prison and people being more positively engaged, or whether that's with family or friends on the outside. I mean, education is not the only thing. So particularly when it comes to release, there are obviously other factors around housing and family and support networks and employment, all those sorts of things. But we know education reduces reoffending. We know education makes it more likely that you will get a job on release. So all of those things together sort of all stem from that kind of very initial engagement in education.
And that must be, from an outsider's point of view, from the prison education system, I would imagine one of the difficulties would be not only that people are alienated from education. We've talked about a lot of this on Teachers Talk Radio, how schools aren't good at dealing with 20-30% of students who leave school with poor qualifications in this country. And within those, there'll be people who are very, very disenchanted with school. So that must be one of the first things you have to overcome, is the sense that having perceived that they failed once in education, they're going to not welcome the idea of being back in the classroom and someone telling them they failed again.
Exactly. And I think that's why those kind of mix of opportunities are really important in any prison setting. So for some, classroom-based learning may still be what's important. For others, it will be the distance learning that we offer, which means that they can stay in their cell, they can work on their course, they can come out and get support where they need to. But that there are different opportunities available to them and different types of support. I think that's the other thing in terms of what we'd like to see more of is individualised support, which just can't happen at the moment in terms of the overstretched system. But the more that you can tailor the topic and the support and the ongoing commitment to that learner, I think the better the longer term outcomes. But it's really, really difficult for learners, I think, or potential learners who aren't even sure that they are learners yet, to step into a classroom or to take up any learning opportunity. There's a lot of bravado around it, and just lots of the kind of things around not just obviously the subject that you're learning, but all of those soft skills that you learn. I remember, again, a long time ago reading about someone who they were actually taking part in another prison project called Find Cell Work, where they teach sewing and embroidery. And this gentleman commented on how through his mentor, he had learned that sometimes people are giving you constructive criticism. And he said previously he would have flown off the handle. He would have got very aggressive at anyone saying anything negative to him because he immediately perceived it as them sort of being angry at him almost. And he realised through taking part in this project that actually you can take some criticism and someone's just trying to help you be better at whatever it is you're doing. And again, we see that all the time through distance learning, people who are realising that the tutors and us as Prison Education Trust, we're there to support them and help them do even better at their learning. But those skills are all things that it takes a while to learn, particularly as an adult when you've already got quite ingrained behaviours and responses.
Yeah. And for how much of the work, I mean, you mentioned work online, because that's something that is an opportunity these days, well, for some time now, really. But as long as you have the access to computers and phones and all those sorts of things, how much of the work is actually in a sort of classroom setting in a prison? I'm trying to imagine the circumstances where people would be able to sort of sit down with a tutor one-to-one or with a group and be in something like a very familiar traditional sort of education setting.
I would say they're poles apart. I think one-to-one tutoring definitely doesn't really happen in prison as such. So there might be some courses, like the distance learning courses that we offer, where you might be able to access a tutor through written correspondence. But there's not so much of the kind of one-to-one stuff happening directly on digital or in the classroom. And then in terms of digital access generally, there's a prison intranet called the Virtual Campus, but that is not connected to the internet and is very closed off, has fairly limited resources on it and limited ability to be sort of interactive, although they are trying to develop that. And that's theoretically available in every prison, but the reality is it does vary because it might be on computers in a room that people can't access for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
There's then some in-cell technology in a smaller number of prisons. And again, what's available on those devices really depends. So there's some provided by the prison service, which have some options on, but are fairly minimal at the moment. And then there's a couple of private providers who are authorised by the prison service to provide laptops within prisons. And again, they're all disconnected from the internet, fairly limited in terms of functionality. I would say they're probably not delivering in terms of up-to-date digital skills that will help people on release, which is not to be critical. There's definite progress and there's people working very hard on it, but progress is slow. There's still a lot of suspicion, I think, around digital devices in prison and around security and how that works. So we've just been able to we're just about to pilot a whitelisted version of our website. And that's with one of the education providers. And whitelisted means that it's completely secure and sort of cut off. So you can't go watch a YouTube video or whatever it might be, but it will give us control over the content and hopefully sort of make it a bit more interesting and interactive. So we're just about to trial that with one of the education providers. And if that rolls out, then that then obviously makes things a lot more accessible. But it is still very dependent on people being able to access devices, and that really varies prison to prison, and they're very easily taken away. And that kind of lining up of person plus device plus the right opportunity on that device is quite a kind of a recipe that we're still trying to get right in different establishments at the moment. So it has improved, but it's still way, way behind anything in the community. I don't think anyone in prison would recognise community provision if they went out and joined a standard classroom as we know it now.
Whatever I might imagine, it doesn't go along to the education department block and go into the classroom and take the register or nothing like that.
No, sadly. As I say, it has improved marginally, and that was mainly a pragmatic response to the pandemic and the fact that things like needing to book visits or medical appointments or things, they just didn't have the staff to go in and do that face-to-face. So they had to use some kind of device. So things improved sort of off the back of the pandemic. And obviously that's then potentially an opportunity in terms of really building on that with the layers of education and different options. But because also the systems are quite, as they're so secure, you almost have to kind of, anything that might work in the community, you have to sort of take it backwards a few versions to make it work on the systems in prison, if that makes sense. So yeah, still work to be done, but people are working on it.
Now, this would actually be a good point to asked Paul to join us again, but we seem to have lost Paul for the moment. If Paul does rejoin us, he's very welcome. I think there, Cassie, what you're describing is something many teachers will be to some extent able to identify with in an ordinary school setting, is that the frustrations of the practical difficulties, the books, there are not enough books to go around, the video recorder's not working, the classroom has been booked by somebody else, the equipment is broken and so on. But that must be hugely magnified in a prison setting. Well, after a brief word from our sponsors and the Teachers Talk Radio News, Cassie, I'd like to get back and hopefully be rejoined by Paul, if we can overcome the technical difficulties, and explore some of the other work of the Prisoners Education Trust and the world of prison education.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading. Introducing My New Term, the revolutionary technology application connecting schools and candidates directly. Whether you're a school seeking to streamline your recruitment process or a candidate searching for your next role in education, My New Term has the solution. Developed by a former teacher, the technology at My New Term now connects tens of thousands of candidates with schools every month by digitizing the recruitment process. As a candidate, you can search for jobs, set up recommended jobs, and save time by applying directly to schools via a standardized online process. No more completing manual and repetitive application forms. Employers can streamline processes and save time utilizing the leading applicant tracking system for schools and multi-academy trusts. Recruitment in education has been broken for too long. My New Term is on a mission to change just that. Visit mynewterm.com to learn more, search all the latest opportunities, or schedule a demo. My New Term, shaping the future of education recruitment.
Hi everyone, it's Tom here from Teachers Talk Radio, just dropping by to tell you about our annual history teaching extravaganza, Teachers Talk History, which is coming at you live in Manchester on the 21st of September. The tickets are completely free for classroom teachers, amazing speakers, brilliant contributors, and a fantastic opportunity to network with fellow professionals. Grab your free ticket today at ttradio.org/events, and we will see you there.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
This is your Teachers Talk Radio News for the week ending the 10th of August. This week, with news dominated by the racist riots across Britain, the Times Education Supplement has reported that the Chartered College of Teaching have called for the government to set up an education working group to consider urgent social issues. With many reports of children as young as 14 taking part in the riots, Daniel Kebede has called for schools to address issues such as the misinformation found on the internet and social media, as well as prejudice and racial stereotyping. Also in the news this week, Scottish exam results. The Scotsman, among other newspapers, reported that trends seen before the pandemic had returned. That is to say, exam results continue to fall, with fewer students achieving higher grades, and a widening attainment gap, increasing year on year. The overall picture being worryingly that in Scotland it's harder to pass your exams, and even harder if you're from a poor background. Scotland was also in the news this week on the BBC and many other news platforms when thousands of students in Scotland received blank results by email or text. Schools Week and the Times Education Supplement have reported that unions welcome Labour's commitment to scrap the Minimum Service Level Act. This will be scrapped as part of the Employment Rights Bill, which Labour is committed to passing in its first 100 days. Paul Whiteman, General Secretary of the School Leaders Union NAHT, said, "We welcome the new government's move to scrap these proposals, which were a vindictive, illogical attack on the basic democratic freedoms. This would, in effect, have meant that if there were further industrial action, schools could have directed members of staff to be in work. Many saw this as counter to a fundamental idea that the withdrawal of labour is a democratic right." iNews reported that the previous Conservative government spent $1.2 million on plans to build a second school run by Britain's strictest head teacher, Catherine Birbal-Singh, before scrapping it, realising that there would not be enough pupils. In line with current trends that will see pupil numbers falling steadily over the next decade in London and across Britain. As previously mentioned, A-level and T-level results day is approaching next Thursday on the 15th of August. The Guardian reports that UK's leading universities have thousands of undergraduate places unfilled a week before the A-level results are published, meaning that more school leavers are likely to gain places than in recent years. A survey by the Press Association found that members of the Russell Group of research-intensive universities were advertising nearly 3,900 vacancies on courses for domestic undergraduates starting in the autumn, compared with 2,000 at this point last year. So the advice this year to all students is that if you don't achieve your first or second choices, there may be many very attractive opportunities through clearing. And finally, in a week, when prospective presidential candidate for the Democrat Party, Kamala Harris, has chosen ex-school history teacher and sports coach Tim Walz to be her running mate, a man who championed LGBT rights and free school meals for all primary school students in Minnesota, the state of Utah has banned books by 15 authors, including Margaret Atwood, Judy Blume, Rupi Kaur, Sarah Maas. This marks the first time books have been banned across an entire state and not just individual districts. These books will be removed from all school libraries in the state of Utah and destroyed. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with John Gibbs. You are listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs on Teachers Talk Radio. My guest this morning, Cassie Edmiston, Paul Grady from the Prisoners Education Trust. And we're discussing the challenges, the rewards and the necessity of prison education. Frustrating, the practical difficulties. You can't have a phone, or you can have a phone under certain circumstances, and so on. If the internet is sometimes infuriating for us, access to it and ability to use it speaks even more so within an environment. One question I had for you, Cassie, is that there's going to be some resistance from the prisoners because they have maybe have this view of education and so on. What about a view from, well, not just the staff, but the wider community, that should you be educating prisoners? Because after all, they're there to be punished. And we're, providing people with education, we'd all like that, wouldn't we, kind of thing? I
think education is one of the areas that people can get on board with. I think you will then, particularly in the wider community, perhaps have differing views on the role of prison broadly, how long people should be in it for, whether people should be in it at all, those sorts of conversations. I mean, the prison population is the largest it's ever been and is projected to be sort of 105,000 in a few years' time. So it's sort of, we've got more and more people in prison for longer and longer, and I think there's a sort of whole debate around that people have differing views on. But when you come to the education aspect of it, I think most people get on board with it to a degree. I think they perhaps are less comfortable with things around digital access and those sorts of things. But when it comes to the principle of education for people in prison, I think people see it as a good thing. And particularly when you sort of show a lot of the stats around it in terms of the backgrounds a lot of people in prison have come from, and a lot of challenges that they faced around abuse or domestic violence, or different sort of substance abuse, whatever it might be. They come from very complex backgrounds, and you need those opportunities to help them, as I said earlier, build that kind of self-confidence, start to learn those different life skills, as well as learning particular qualifications or knowledge or whatever it might be through different courses. So I think broadly people buy into it and understand it. But I think broader conversations around the role of prison are then a little bit more interesting. What I think people often expect is that education in prison will therefore, if you do sort of work in that area, it's therefore very like the community. And I think that's the challenge, is helping people to understand how different it is and how challenging it is, and how any learner who's achieving anything in the prison setting is doing a very good job, because it's very easy to be distracted. You could be transferred. There can be any number of interruptions. Your materials get lost. Your paperwork gets lost. You can't find a pen and paper. Sort of very basic things will stop you. And so you have to be motivated, or find that motivation. And you can do that then with the support of staff in the education department and us, the PET, and whoever else it might be.
I would imagine from outside that there are all sorts of problems in prisons, drugs and violence and resources and so on. One would be high levels of illiteracy. Would that be fair to say that that is something that the first stage of education problem, the first obstacle overcoming in prison education is that you're going to encounter many adults who have profound levels of problems with literacy?
Absolutely, and that's why the prison education contract, so the contracted education provision in prisons, focuses on literacy and numeracy, because the need for that is so broad and so vast that that has to be the case. And so whilst in an ideal world, education be tailored to all levels and provide everything, and that would be lovely. The reality is, with the contracts as they exist and the resources that they have, it has to focus on literacy and numeracy to help bring people up to a certain level. That's then supplemented by other organisations that might be doing some work in this space. So there's a few different organisations that work in literacy particularly, and a few in numeracy, that are often kind of peer-to-peer based. So you use that model to help supplement some of the classroom stuff that happens by the education providers. But yeah, that's absolutely the focus. And then it's sort of the idea is that if they're then in have a long enough sentence, they will then progress onto possibly some of the other opportunities that might be available in the prison. But if not, they can then move on to a PET course, and by that point will have attained the levels that they need to be able to do it. Particularly as a correspondence course, you need to be able to read the materials and access it. Sometimes we get a kind of, why do I have to have level 2s to go and do a distance learning course? And it's for that reason. Otherwise, we don't want to set people up to fail, and we want to make sure they've got the best possible opportunity to succeed. Otherwise, you're just compounding all of the issues that we've already talked about. So making sure that they've got that kind of those level 2s, that they've got the best chance of success is important. But we're part of that, as I say, prison education ecosystem, and providing those different, there have to be as many opportunities as possible for people to be able to participate in education in its broader sense.
And I would imagine it would be a life-changing thing to take someone from being unable to read, in effect, to being able to read and teach, and join in the world that they feel excluded from.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, prepping for this earlier, I was reading some more stories of different people who just being able to engage in the prison environment more positively, because if you can't read, then you can't see the signs, you can't read the forms. There's prisons are fans of posters. There's posters up about all sorts of things, but if you can't read them, then you're not going to know what you might be able to access. And so by building those literacy skills and being able to read those signs, it does open up a world, albeit a limited one within the prison space, but nonetheless you start to sort of be able to see that and engage better. And then it opens up more sort of opportunities on top of that.
And what is the best argument for prison education? What in other words, how successful is it? Are you finding a lot of people drop out, or that? And there's always, the success. Paul, we mentioned taking all the way to master's degrees. Is that a common experience or a rare experience?
I think it's rare to take it all the way to masters,
yes,
but it's common in terms of positive engagement and course completion. So it depends on the type of course, but our completion rates overall vary between 60 and 70%. And it depends on the sort of a slightly unfair comparison, because there's different types of assessment within that and different types of courses. But I would say a lot of people do complete and then go on to do their next course, or they go on to take on a different type of volunteering role in prison, or they take on a different job in prison, and then once they're released, they then sort of build on that and build on their expertise and knowledge. I mean, I think fundamentally it increases the chance of rehabilitation and release, so that reduces reoffending, it increases the chance of getting a job on release, and there's some really robust Ministry of Justice research done by their Justice Data Lab into our work that evidences that. Mentally, I think one argument that often resonates is that although people are now in for longer and longer sentences, ultimately the majority will be released from prison, and it's far better to have someone who's been released who's had developed some skills and all of those kind of soft life skills that we need, and is positively going to engage in the community on release, rather than someone who's just become really institutionalized and sort of just been living in a horrific environment for however long. Because prisons are, a horrible place to be, particularly at the moment. If you read some of the prison inspection reports, they're just awful. They're not places where we should be. Some of the buildings are not places we should be keeping humans at all. But I think it's far better to prepare people for life on release, so they have got a better chance of success, less likely to reoffend and create more victims, less likely to return to prison and just continue that cycle. And I just think the power of education is really important, and not just education for employability or education to get to a particular career, but the value of education in itself and all of those things, all the positives that we know it brings. I think it's just really important, and can really open up opportunities and metaphorical doors for people in terms of their life opportunities, particularly post-release.
As you say, if you're simply in an environment that you can understand better, if your sense of self-esteem, the narrative of failure that you've carried with you can be disrupted in some way. That's aside from the fact that you might leave with usable qualifications or whatever. Before you mentioned that there were this robust sort of research has been looked at this, Ministry of Justice has said this, there is an effect on reducing levels of reoffending. If you hadn't said that to me, I'd have said that must be true, mustn't it? I mean, it seems to me that it's self-evident that education must have a transformingly positive effect.
Preaching to the converted here, but I think some people still like that evidence. I think, again, it's that kind of personal preference. Some people like to hear the sort of stories and hear about the people, and some people like the data and want to see it evidence. And I think Justice Data Lab, I would say it to be self-evident, but I think for those who like the kind of the Justice Data Lab, who like that kind of robust evidence, I think it's really important.
No, sorry, go ahead.
I was just picking up another point that you said earlier about usable qualifications. I think that's another thing that's important, is that making sure that whatever people are studying in prison is a course that they can complete, because there's a lot of courses that can't be done in prison because of the equipment that's needed, or particular types of training or exams that might be needed, but also that it's a meaningful qualification and that it's recognised in the industries that people want to go into. So we fund a lot of health and safety courses, and they're accredited and industry recognised, and that's important because people don't want to sort of come out with either a qualification that's meaningless because it's not recognised in the industry, or because it's a qualification that's sort of recognised by its nature as being something that you might have done in prison and therefore labels you. And so I think that kind of meaningful qualification is hugely important as well. So if people are going to invest their time in something, I mean, as with all of us, if you're going to invest your time in something, then it needs to be something that's meaningful and will have an impact on what your long-term goal is, whatever that is.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned things like beekeeping and so on. You can do courses which are going to all the things we said earlier about self-esteem and so on. If you want, though, to end with a qualification, how easy is that to complete an exam, to be attested? That must be, again, I'm just imagining the obstacles.
It is really challenging. It is possible in some places. Some prisons have worked out ways to be set up as exam centres so that they can run exams for some qualifications in certain circumstances. But again, it really does depend. And one of the challenges is that someone could be in a prison where that's possible, and then they get transferred out, and the next prison they go to, it's not possible, and then they won't be able to do the exam. And so I think that's another issue, is allowing people to complete those qualifications in the establishment where they started them, particularly those where you are reliant on an exam. Because if that prison has somehow found a way to be set up as a centre, then enabling someone to complete that before they're transferred, I think, is hugely important. But sadly, it doesn't happen at the moment. We hear a lot of people being transferred before they can finish. And that's frustrating because it's sort of taken out of their control.
And with a lot of exams, you've got to be there in person, or you've got to go to an exam room, or there are courses you can complete online and get the qualification. But
yeah, and as I say, some prisons have set up so they will have a room set aside, and they'll have someone who can invigilate it. They do have a process, but it takes usually a very dedicated member of staff, usually, sometimes a few, and a real commitment to it. And I would say they're probably the minority rather than in the main. So it is something that, if to get the full qualification, you need the exam, we will say from the start, and we will make sure we talk to the learner about whether they can do the exam in their prison. And some will continue with it anyway because they just want to study the subject and they don't necessarily want to worry about the exam just yet. But others will then hold off until, if as and when they're in an establishment where they can do it.
When earlier, when I said to you that, I'm glad there's research, clearly I wasn't suggesting they shouldn't, but not because it has to be proven, because in a sense, it seems to be self-evident. Therefore, I would think your organisation is knocking at an open door, that the prison system and politicians are highly receptive to this. I mean, as an organisation, you're lobbying as well, I assume, and providing the evidence so that people say, well, but surely how much convincing do people need that education should be ingrained and deeply embedded in prisons?
It's sort of similar to my answer earlier. I think people don't necessarily need to be convinced, but the challenge is the space within which we're operating. So at a time when the prison population is at its highest, it's understaffed, it's overstretched, walls are literally crumbling, people can't access bits of the prison system, there are security issues, the inspectorate is constantly raising the challenges. It has a process called urgent notification for prisons where it's particularly bad, and they've raised more of those, I think, in the past sort of year than they have done previously. It's such a kind of challenging system within which to work. So I think everyone sort of agrees with the principle, but the reality is there are kind of bigger challenges in terms of just keeping the system going, particularly as more and more people are coming into it. And then there's challenges around funding, not just for PET specifically, but for prison education broadly. I don't think it's really changed in real terms for a long time. And so those contracts are having to deliver more and more with real terms, less and less, and are really struggling because they've got a broader population who have got huge diverse needs, lots of neurodiversity, different academic levels, all the challenges already spoken about. And I just think it's a very big challenge that requires a lot more focus. It's just so difficult when you've got such a big prison system as it currently stands. So, I think people do agree with it, but I just don't think it's a priority in terms of a sort of policy moment when
too many other things.
Yeah.
If you're going to fix the prison system, where to start, maybe that becomes a lower priority. Paul, welcome back.
Hello, I do apologise, but I
Not at
was
all.
actually there and I could hear everything you said. And
Super.
then when you started saying you couldn't see me, I was starting to have a very surreal moment.
I'm sure you said, Paul, are you here, actually? I don't know. I don't think we could hear you. But we
Yes,
were
you
talking
can
about
hear it, though.
we were talking about the practical problems and difficulties. So the actual day-to-day thing, you've taken education to a very successful level. But all the way through, as you're studying online in prison, how did it actually work, and what were the frustrations and difficulties you had to overcome?
But lots, lots and lots and lots. Listen, when you were talking about education in prison, you've got to think that education in prison is probably at least 20 years behind society as it is now. Obviously, there's no online. They do have computers, but the information technology that they're teaching is basically how to use Word, how to use Excel, how to use Publisher. And that was the amount of your information technology sort of teaching up to level 2. So that's as much as you got. It was all classroom based, mostly, unless you're doing distance learning. But then, obviously, you haven't got the access to the internet, you haven't got digital access. Laptops are few and far between. Don't have access to the internet, even if you do get one. It's basically just open up and use word processor, really. You type your dissertations on it and then take it to the education department to get it printed. And that is basically what a laptop did to you.
Then you put it in the post kind of thing.
Yes, put it in the post. The big thing for me, especially doing an art degree online, was you had to do all your art, send it off, then wait for a reply, but carry on doing it whilst you're doing it. And it would take that long. I'd be sometimes waiting 2, maybe 3 months to get the replies from everything. And by that time, you found yourself going down sort of a dead end. It wasn't working. And by the time you got your feedback, which would say probably go down this direction, you then got to backtrack. And 2 months later, you just done. Really, I wouldn't say it wouldn't amount to much, but you always learn no matter what you're doing. But it's some of you could have been focusing somewhere else. It's very frustrating. The reason why I did enjoy it, I loved it and carried on doing it. But the one reason I didn't go any further with the distance learning for my course, it took me 4 years to get my first 120 points. So for what would be a year in university, it took me 4 years doing it distance learning because of the doing and throwing and how long it took. And once I got the opportunity to ask if I could go to university, like I say, I did my first year of university on day release from an open prison, which was the best opportunity I could have got. Everything that led to that, I left school with absolutely no qualifications. I'm not going to say I didn't do really well at school. I didn't enjoy school, put it that way.
Yes.
They put me in for so many exams, and I told them I'm not going to be doing exams, I'm going to get a job. As soon as I turned 16, I'm off, I'm leaving, I'm going to get a job. Exams weren't for me at that point. And then, so when I'm coming up to go to university, I've got no exams, I've got nothing. I've got level 2s that I've done in prison, level 3s that I've done in prison, 1 year of distance learning. Took all that into the university and went, you can give me a place. But obviously, I had a portfolio and everything else. There was no sense academic background to me. Because I didn't do anything at school, didn't do sixth form, didn't do college. And then going and being told that, what you've done, the fact that you've actually got your first 120 points is more than enough to get you into university. I was going to carry on from year 2, but they advised me to start year 1 and redo year 1.
Right.
So as the whole cohort together, rather than starting going in as a stranger in year 2.
And did you ever feel like it was that you couldn't do this, it was just taking too long, you were going to give it up, or what kept you going, basically?
The love of what I was doing. I was, like I said before, I'd always been able to draw. I'd started painting once I got into prison and doing other stuff, doing sculpture, with whatever we could get our hands on, whether that be paper mache, sculpture with clay was a great one in prison. You want to see some of the sculptures that are made out of bread, they're amazing. But the thing is, it's that love of that and the desire to learn something new. I was learning so much about art and the art world, and getting this knowledge in was amazing. And it was that push to discover more. Like I said, I'd enjoyed drawing and painting, but didn't know nothing about art. I knew about the Mona Lisa, I knew about Van Gogh. I didn't know anything other than that. Probably I knew about Campbell Soup, as everyone does. But that you know what is thrown into popular culture, but you don't know anything about the art. And I was learning and discovering that. And now it had this passion within me. And that's what education as a whole does. Yeah.
Well, were people encouraging? When you said, I want to pursue art, did you find that the staff, other prisoners, were encouraging or were admiring, or the opposite?
You get a mixed reaction because the thing with prison is just it's a microcosm of society in general.
Yes.
You get people that like stuff, you get people that don't like stuff. It's not different to the world outside. It's just inside.
Yes.
And but some of the best people I've met have been people in prison. And I'm still friends with them today. Some of the worst people I've met are in prison, and I'm definitely not friends with them today. But that's the whole thing about prison. It's no different to society as a whole. It's a bit more compact, and because it's so ingrained and you're so close together, there can be sort of ructions, as there is anywhere. But you find a lot of people are very supportive of you, be that education department and the officers themselves, other prisoners. And I remember my cousin came to see me on a visit when I was in the open prison, and she, one of her friends was also in there, and he was working in the cafe that they all came in before they came into the visits. And he recognised her, she recognised him. They didn't know me through each other. But he said to her, "Who are you coming to see?" And she said, "Oh, I'm going to see Paul." And I went, "The artist." And it's that sort of thing. It's just little things like that sort of made you think, you know what, I'm actually doing something that people are recognising.
Yes.
And actually being given that title in prison is quite it's a boost to the ego, and it keeps you wanting to do more as well. And that's the same with everyone else, whatever they're doing. And you can see it, like I said, I've known people that are doing psychology, that are doing law, that are doing other sort of distance learning courses, and have gone on to have met people in jail that are now running their own businesses around prisons, or also around sort of mentoring people when they come out of prison.
Yes.
One of my best friends in prison became a trustee of society. And that shows you the value of education within prison.
Absolutely.
You can take it.
And Paul, I think you've said something very important there about education, which all teachers could learn. I think they know it, actually. I don't want to patronise teachers for this, but it's about self-esteem, isn't it? It's the important, so we none of us take that for granted, that we are our jobs, we are our titles, we are we are reflected in how other people see us. And to be described as an artist, I'd love that, actually, if someone said that to me. I think
my nephew said it to me all the time. I got out of prison when he was just about 2 years old. He's now 11, and he still says, "Are you still an artist?" Yes. It's just
yeah, wonderful. We are coming towards the end of the time that we've allocated for this, so I'll end with this question. First to Cassie, then to you, Paul. If you could say, elections are coming up and governments are changing and so on, if we could have something that could make a difference to, if we all agree, anyone listening to this would agree that education's a good thing in prisons and so on, what would make life easier? And I'm afraid I'll probably lead with simply money and funding and so on. But what one thing could we do that would make it more practically better and more successful than it is? You can have as many as you like, actually.
In that case, I'll go with 4. So I think funding, you're right. I mean, fundamentally, prison education broadly needs more funding. I mean, in an ideal world, PET wouldn't exist because all of these opportunities would be part of a core funded provision of prison education in all prisons. And, it would you would have a lot more opportunities, and as part of that core provision there'd be a lot more funding available. I think the other thing is around digital access. Although it is improving, it is still very slow, still very backwards, and still nothing like it is in the community. And I think that's doing a real disservice both to the teachers operating in the space and to the learners who need to learn not only the subjects but also the digital skills around it. I think there's something around more support for teachers and for the support staff around them. Teachers everywhere are overworked and overstretched, but I think particularly in the prison environment, it's particularly difficult. You're very siloed, often just, not only as a department within the system, but within the broader, prison system and teaching world. And I think that's very difficult, and I think there should be more support for teachers. And then I also think, and this sort of links back to the original point around funding, by having more funding and more resources and capacity, being able to provide much more tailored learning and support to individuals in prison, so that you can help people who have got different neurodiversity conditions, who are at different academic levels, who might have different interests, who might need different types of support, who've got English as a second language, who may be suffering from all sorts of trauma and all of those sorts of things. But that personalised learning is only really possible if you've got the resources and funding to do it.
And Paul, what would have, and you can have more than one thing, what would have made it easier for you on your journey through education and prison?
Education should be on the par with anything else within prison. In fact, to me, it should be above. Because if you're a convicted prisoner, you must work in prison. There is no option not to work. You'll get what's called a nick, and you'd be in trouble. You'd be in front of the governor. You'd get fines. You could get added days and stuff like that for not working. But education was seen as the poor man's relation to working. It paid less than work. It was basically you tended, when you first came out of prison, you were tended to be forced onto education to do level 1 English, maths and IT before you could get any work. So it seemed to be a forced thing on you. For me, education should be seen as something that's equal, if not above work. Should pay the same rate as work, so that you're not. If you don't get any money whilst you're in prison, doing education for the whole time you're in prison isn't worthwhile. You're probably on half the wages that anybody else will give in prison. Now, when I'm saying wages in prison, if you've got a good job in prison, you're probably going to be earning £20 a week. So if you and that's to get everything that you need, toiletry-wise, little luxuries that you get whilst you're in prison. You're given the basics, you're given floors, you're given food, you're given a bed. But then there's also the little things that people want as well, that you have to buy yourself. If people don't understand about prison, you're not given everything in prison. And if you're getting half the wages of somebody else, that £20 seems a lot better than £10. £200 seems better than £100 all day. And for me, that would be put education on that par, and that will get more people into education as well, because then you're not sacrificing to do it. But then it's also about, when it does come to education, I would love education to offer a broader sort of curriculum. It shouldn't just be English, maths and IT. There should be more. It is getting a bit better now that they've given the governors more control, and they can see what their prison needs and what the area around that prison needs, and they can give a bit more that way. But the arts have always been, and I'm going to be banging from that drum for the rest of my life, probably. Sort of seen as a poor relation, and we can get rid of them because it doesn't give us anything.
Yes.
So the arts give the world everything, Everything that you look at comes from an artistic style.
Yes.
You look at houses.
There'll be a few teachers agree with that in schools as well.
Yeah.
But,
And it can lead into other stuff. Yes.
Yeah.
If you find somebody that's interested in summer, it gives you that in. Like for me, I wouldn't have gone to education had it not had an art department, and I wouldn't have stayed in education had it not had an art department. But that led me on to doing other things like taking up to the highest level that I could within education, to doing sort of graphic design courses as well, which could lead to a job once you get released.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's all these opportunities that are there, but we should broaden it. When we had austerity, prisons were hit like they'd never been hit before, and so many courses were just cut because they were getting funding cut from left, right, and centre. And it's basically you get the basics and that's it. And that was throughout prisons at all. And it's easing a little bit, but I would like it to really offer more and offer as much as it possibly can. And I think that way you'd get more people into it.
Well, Cassie and Paul, thank you so much for your time. And I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I've learned a lot about the Prison Education Trust and what's possible. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And that brings to an end another episode of the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs here on Teachers Talk Radio. This week we've been exploring the work of the Prisoners Education Trust with my guests Cassie Edmiston and Paul Grady. If you've enjoyed listening to our discussion, you can listen to it again as a podcast on Spotify, on Podbean, or on the Teachers Talk Radio site, where you can find past episodes of the Friday Morning Break and all the other shows that have appeared on Teachers Talk Radio, covering many, many topics. Thank you for listening. See you again in 2 weeks' time.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.